Welcome to the tutorial, Spotted Yellow Spring Fever. This tutorial is a painting that is a little bit on the easier side. So for those of you that are just beginning watercolorists, this one is exactly what you're looking for. This one is in conjunction again with the Monroeville Public Library and the Monroeville Arts Council, both great organizations. I hope you will patronize them as they are doing so many things to interest the public, so many different things. You can check their websites and their calendars for events, but they do sponsor these tutorials, and I know there are quite a few people that enjoy watching them. We're going to be using a 2-inch brush or whatever you have that's close to that, a nice flat brush for the big sky area. We're also going to be using our fan brush and an oval brush, a filbert or something similar to that. We'll be using a wisp and a rigger, and we're also going to be using my number 4 round. If you don't have those exact brushes, then don't run out and buy them for sure. Just try to find something similar. Colors today, we're using cerulean blue. We're also going to be using cadmium yellow. We're going to be using sap green. We'll be using burnt umber, which is the darker of the browns. And we'll be using some black. We are also going to be using or your table salt, your regular table salt. We're going to be using some biscuit that you want to put on ahead of time and allow to dry. And then you're also going to be using your sponge. So whatever, whatever kind of sponge you have, you want to make sure it's the spokey kind though. Your drawing today, you should draw your horizon line, all 3 sections of grasses, and at least the bigger parts of your tree. That way you'll know where your biggest trunk and limbs will be. You do not have to draw in all of the thin ones. You also want to misket in all of the little yellow flowers. Those are just little dots. You can do those with the end of a toothpick. Do not use your brushes for misket because misket will ruin your brushes. We're going to wet the whole sky area nice and wet. You want to get used to working with very wet areas because it's much easier to have your painting dry slower than to have it dry quicker, and then your paint lines become hard lines. Those are hard to erase or take care of, but as long as your painting is wet, your paint will flow so much better. Don't try to drag your paint through and use it until it's dry brushing. Keep wetting your area and your paint. Once you get that water on, you can wipe your table off, move your paint or your paper around a little bit, allow that water to even out. And then we're going to be brushing through some black mixed with some cerulean. We're just going to brush that through with our big 2-inch flat in strokes because your paper is nice and wet. It's going to flow nice and easily. Make sure your paint is also nice and watery. Put a lot of nice pigment in there, and then we're just going to draw some long strokes of that color because that water is going to carry that paint and also soften the hard edges. So once you get your paint on, you want to make sure you put it in a little bit darker than you would expect because it does dry later. I added a little bit of extra cerulean up in the corner, and now I'm just going to lift my paper up, tilt it in all directions, allow that paint to move around slightly and soften. You'll get all nice soft edges that way. Rewipe your table so that that water doesn't come back in on your painting. Then when you lay that down, you're just going to allow that paint to settle in and allow it to dry. If you want to help it to dry, you can go ahead and use a hair dryer, but just be careful that you hold the hair dryer far enough away that you're not blowing the paint. You're just, you don't want to blow it and then have it create hard edges. Once you get your paint where you want it to be, then just set it down on your table and leave it alone. You want to make sure that that's nice and dry before we move on to the grass, because you don't want your grassy sections to bleed up into that wet sky. So just allow it to sit, allow it to dry, or dry it with a hair dryer, and then we will move on to the grasses. The grasses we're going to do in sections. It really doesn't matter what section you do first, but you want to watch the video ahead because each section has different things going on in it. I'm going to start with my upper section of grass. I'm using just plain sap green for now, and then I will drag through sap green mixed with a little bit of black once it's painted. My paint is nice and wet. I keep going back into my palette to get more paint. I don't try to drag it and stretch it. If you do that, it's going to dry quicker for you, and then you won't have the ability to blend your colors. But if you keep your paint nice and wet, you'll have the ability to drag different colors through, and they will soften in the wet paint. If you do go over your tree trunk, it's not a terrible thing because your tree trunk will be darker, but especially the bigger, thicker parts of my trunk and my branches, I try to go around them as much as I can. If you don't, or if you go inside the line, it's okay. Nothing's going to hurt your tree trunk here. Again, nice and wet. You want your paint to be nice and wet so that we can do things with that wet paint even once it's put on. You're going to be pulling off the top into the sky to give it an uneven edge. And like I said before, we're going to be dragging a darker color through that. So you want that paint to be nice and wet in order for that to happen. Keep it nice and wet. And then once you get that grass put on, we're going to mix that sap with a little bit of black. If you don't want to use black, you can use some indigo blue, or you can even use some burnt umber. But you want to mix a little bit of your sap green with another darker, deeper color, because we're going to be dragging that through along the horizon line a little bit, and then dragging it through horizontally through the grass, just to change up the color, to make it look like there's different things growing in that grass and it's not so flat looking. You can use a smaller flat for that, or as I had mentioned before, it's a brush called a filbert. But if you don't have a filbert or an oval, that's okay. You can just use really any of the brushes that you're comfortable with using. We're also going to throw on a little bit of salt then, and I tried to throw it in the areas that I painted a little bit darker. So I'm just going to throw a little bit of salt on that. I'm also going to be using my number 4 round, and I'm going to be dry brushing the upper edge of my grass into the sky. By dry brushing, I'm just laying my brush on its side flat and then pulling that brush towards me lightly to break that even green line and make it look like there's, taller grasses growing off in the distance. And then we're just gonna, if you didn't throw some salt on, throw some salt on before it dries. And we're gonna allow that section to dry a little bit. I'm not going to go into the next section right away because obviously my top section is still wet, and unless you want to dry that with a hair dryer, I'm going to skip that little middle section and go right down into my bottom section. That way it won't affect anything because that one does not touch my upper section. So I'm going to move down to my bigger section. This is my foreground section. I'm going to be doing basically the same thing. I'm going to be painting in with my sap green. I'm painting right over all of my misketing, all of my little dots of misket, painting right over that. And I am going to be dragging through some different colors. I'm going to drag through some yellow, and I'm also going to drag through my darker sap mixed with black. If you want to drag through all yellow, if you want to drag through some umber, that would be fine also. But you just want to, again, change all of that coloring so that it's not all just a flat sap color. You want to give some depth to your grasses to make it look like some might be growing taller. There might be some bumps in the dirt in the field, and you can do that by changing up the colors. Now go ahead and drag through some other colors. Again, I'm dragging them through horizontally. I'm not dragging them through vertically. I'm dragging them through horizontally. Some are zigzag. They're not all perfect straight lines because things grow in fields, not in perfect straight lines. So I'm trying to make this look as realistic as possible by just dragging through some other colors. Plan it in your head first before you begin, but again, you want to make sure that your greens are nice and wet. So when you add those other colors through, they're going to bleed into that wet green paint, and you'll have softer edges, you'll have softer blends of your color. Same thing then again along that upper edge of that section. I'm going to use my number 4 round, lay it flat on its side, and just push it upwards so that I am putting a nice uneven edge to that grass, making it look like there's some tall grass, some short grass, maybe some weeds growing, just to make it look a little bit more realistic like a field. Allow that to dry real well. You can throw some salt on before you do that if you'd like. And then we're going to move on to the third section. The third section should not be done until both of the upper and the lower sections are dry, because we want to create a hard line, and by doing that you want your wet paint to hit up against dry paint. So I am making sure that my upper and my lower sections are wet. Now it looks to me as if there's a little bit of a moss covered little pond or something in there. So I'm just painting a small area of that middle section with some sap green mixed with some yellow. Not making it the whole section, but just a nice even part of a little section of the middle. I will allow that to dry, and then I'll paint the rest of that section in with my sap. And on this section, because it looks like it might be the bank of a little pond, I'm going to drag through some color, but I'm going to drag through the color in this middle section at an angle, going from right to left or left to right, at an angle to make it look like it's going uphill. But otherwise, you're going to be doing the same thing. Allow that pond color to dry, and then go ahead in with your coloring for your middle section. Again, it's just some sap green. And after I get that all painted in, you'll see when you paint up against your dry sections, you'll get a hard line. That's going to help to separate out that middle section from the other sections. And even though I'm painting that in between two dry sections, I still want that middle section to be nice and wet so that I can drag through my other color and have it have a nice soft blend to it. I don't want a hard line. I don't want it to look striped. I want to have some nice soft edges to that. Now I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to take my brush, lay it on its side, and do a little bit of dry brushing. And I'm also going to use my wisp brush. That's a brush that kind of looks like a comb, and I'm going to comb some grasses up from that third or that middle section into the third section. If you don't have a wisp, you could do it with a rigger doing single blades of grass, or you can just use your round and not have anything so detailed and just do your dry brushing. It's up to you. However, you want to get some different heights so that it doesn't look like the grass has been mowed. This is a field. You want to have different heights of grasses. So if you don't have a wisp and you don't want to use or you can't use a wisp, you can use a rigger, or you can continue to use your round brush on its side as dry brushing, Or you could even use your fan brush, although with your fan brush you might get sections or blades of grass that are a little thick. Now you want to make sure everything is really nice and dry, and we're going to start to use our sponge and sponge in the foliage on that big tree. This is a nice spring tree, so the foliage is just coming out as nice little leaves. So we are going to use our sponge and also our fan brush, and later on we'll be using our wisp to make real fine little leaves. When you're using your sponge, I'm using just some sap green, and I am dabbing lightly so that just the tips of that rough sponge are hitting the paper. I don't want any big blots of solid color because this is all fine, fine little foliage leaves that are just starting to come out. So I'm just touching the paper lightly with the edges of my sponge. I'm twisting my sponge, moving my sponge in all directions so that I don't get the same imprint everywhere. And I'm following where my branches would be. You don't want to do everything in one section. You want to think in your mind where your branches are, and then that way your foliage is going to follow where you're going to be painting in a branch. With your fan brush, you're dipping it in your paint and you're just splashing with that fan lightly because otherwise it'll splatter everywhere. But this will also give you some nice, really fine little leaves. And once we get all of the branches painted on, then we will use the wisp brush, and I will show you how to do some more foliage with your wisp. But you want to splatter with your fan. If you splatter somewhere where you don't want it to be, just simply blot it up quickly with a Kleenex. But you want to make sure that you get enough sponging and splatter to make your tree look a little bit full. It needs to look full because it's just sprouting all of its spring foliage. And if you don't have enough, it's going to look like a bare winter tree. Now, before we take off any of our misket, we want to go back and with our sponge, and we're going to sponge in over those clumps of our misket to make it look like those are different things than grass. Okay, so we know that they are little flowers, dandelions, or some kind of a spring flower. So I'm sponging in over those clumps to give it the impression that there's different kinds of growth in the grass where those flowers will be, whether it be little dandelion leaves or some kind of ivy or whatever you want it to be. But you want it to, you want the impression that there's other things growing in that grass. So I'm just sponging where my misket is. Where all of my misket is, I'm going to put my sponge marks, and then while my sponge marks are nice and wet, I'm just dropping in a little bit of extra paint. Not anything too much, just a little bit here and there, only where the sponge paint is nice and wet. I don't want hard lines. I want to have extra color, but I don't want it to be hard lines. I want it to be nice blended color that will blend into the grass and not, not make it look like there's hard, defined, individual grasses or plants. I want this to look nice and soft as I continue on. Again, you want to make sure everything is dry before you start doing too much else. The next thing that we're going to be working on is going to be our nice big tree. So we're going to be mixing umber and black to be painting in our tree. I'm using my number 4 round, and I'm going to be painting in my biggest branches and my trunk with my round. I'm going to use a bunch of different brushes to be painting my branches and my fine branches. My trunk and my biggest branches, I'll use my number 4 round. And then after I get my biggest branches in, then I'm going to be moving to a rigger. And I'll do all of my smaller branches and then my real fine branches with my rigger. The only thing that I will salt on this tree is a little bit of my main trunk, and that's just to give it a little bit of a roughness to it. I'm not going to be salting the other branches and the fine branches for 2 reasons. Number 1, you wouldn't even see any texture on your fine branches, and there's a lot of growth on those branches, so you wouldn't be seeing any of the texturing anyway. So plan it. If you even want to sketch it in with a pencil as you go, that's fine. But you want to make sure that if you have a lot of green down where you want your branch to be, just paint around that green. Don't paint over all of the green. Leave some of it in front of the branches just to make it look more realistic. But again, you want to put in a lot of branches. You don't have to put in a lot of big, thick, heavy branches, but you want to put in a lot of finer branches, and especially the finest little branches that all of this foliage is growing off of. Take your time with your branches. If you want to watch the next few minutes of the video before you proceed, you can, but you will see how I'm putting in quite a few branches. I want to make my tree nice and full to accommodate all of the foliage that I have in there. Now, once you are happy with all of your little fine branches, of course you can always continue to add these. But once you're happy with those, then we're going to add in some more of the foliage. And we're going to be putting more foliage in, as I had mentioned before, with our wisp brush. If you don't have a wisp brush, you could use your fan brush, but you want to go lightly with the fan brush. Your wisp brush is going to allow you to put in little fine leaves and have them nice and close together. So you'll be using the tip of your wisp, and you're just going to be moving that around on the branches that you've already painted in. And you'll do that on mainly the edges, but of course you can take this wisp and put your little foliage in anywhere. But this is a great way to fill in all of those little fine branches with finer little leaves so that it doesn't look like your foliage, is 6 months old. It's just coming out. It's spring. And this is putting on all of those nice little dots for you. I'm going to give you a close-up in a few minutes so you can see exactly what this wisp brush is doing. You want to move your wisp around. Don't have it going in one direction everywhere. Move it left and right, up and down. But you can see how you're getting those nice little tiny leaves with this wisp brush. It does a great job for things like that. We're going to take off all of our biscuit now so that we can paint in all of the flowers. Here's a great look at all of that great fine, fine, fine little foliage that's done with your wisp. It does such a great job, things like that. Get all of your biscuit off. It'll take you a little bit of time, but take your time to get it off. Make sure you get it off nice and easily. You can take it off with your finger or with an eraser, but you want to get all of your misgetting off so that we can go ahead and paint in the flowers. I painted those in just cad yellow. I used my number 4 round. You don't have to be exact because it's yellow, so if you go outside the line, it's not going to affect that much. The green will accept it. Instead of trying to get exact little dots, I'm not doing that. You can just paint it in. Of course, you don't want to get too haphazard and make it look like you have yellow lines everywhere, but you don't have to paint just exactly the little white dot is what I'm trying to say. You want to get those all painted in. If you want to stop and start, you can. It doesn't matter, even if you get hard lines. These are just little flowers. It's not going to affect anything, but if you get tired of painting in little yellow dots, take a break, have a cup of tea, get a glass of wine, make your dinner, do whatever, and then you can come back and continue to paint. Now once your flowers are all painted in, we're going to go back in now, and just with straight black, I'm going to be painting in those little black posts, the fence posts. You're not going to see really any fencing because it's so far in the distance and it's probably just wire fencing. So what you're really just seeing are the fence posts themselves. I just painted those black, just straight little black lines. Of course, the ones closest to you will be a little bit thicker. You don't have to do too many. It's up to you how many you want to do, but I just did 4 or 5. You don't have to make them even go straight in a line. They can, be on both sides of the grass. I have some in my middle section. I have one in my first section. And then once you get your fence posts placed, then we are going to decide where we want to put in. There is a nice bush or a smaller tree in the background. You can decide where you want to put that. You can work that around your fence posts, but that's going to be done with some black mixed with some umber. And you're going to be using your nice fine rigger for that, because it's going to be nice thin branches since it's in the distance. It's not up close. So just your rigger, decide where you're going to put it. And it's kind of a nice full kind of bushy tree. So it's going to have a lot of nice branches that go off in all directions, straight up, off to the right, off to the left. You're going to have some that are bent, some that look like elbows, a lot of fine ones, and we're going to do the same thing then, filling in that foliage, both with splatter and with your wisp brush, because again, you don't want big leaves, you want nice fresh foliage that's just coming out, spring foliage. They go in all directions. Fine ones, especially real fine ones, going in all directions towards the ends of the branches, the bigger branches. You can have it go tall up into your sky so that you can get some of those little fine points into your sky area. And once you have all of your branches in and you're happy with where all of your branches are, then you'll start to put in your little fine leaves. Going to do it the same way we did on the tree. Just some nice fine little, very tiny little dots. You don't have to press hard. You're just going to have the tips of your brush touching your paper. You're going to be turning it in all directions, not just all vertical. Some can be horizontal. You can use it also to splatter a little bit, like you did with your fan brush earlier. However you want to get those nice fine little branch or little leaves on. Again, if you're splattering, have a Kleenex ready so that if you splatter and it goes somewhere that you don't want it to be, you can hurry and wipe or blot so that you don't, have your splatter everywhere. You can always add. So if you want to stop for a little while and then go back to it, you can. But you want to do less. Less is better. You can always add. It's very difficult to take off. And once you've finished with that, then we have another beautiful painting. Yellow fever. Spring fever is definitely close. Again, I thank the Monroeville Library and the Monroeville Arts Council for sponsoring these tutorials. We will continue on with additional tutorials in the future, and we're glad that you chose to watch the tutorial. You'll get some beautiful paintings from these tutorials, and of course we hope that you will look on to the Monroeville Public Library site and the Monroeville Arts Council sites to see some of the additional things that they do. They do way more than just watercolor painting. So if you're interested in other things, please look them up. But in the meantime, especially here, happy painting. My name's Marcy Mason, and I thank you for joining us.